Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I could welcome you to today's meeting of the Public-Petitions-Committee. As always, can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and electronic devices because it interferes with our sound system. Can I start by issuing a very warm welcome to Chick Brodie and Richard Lyle to the committee. Richard, I think, was a member of the committee at the start of the session, replaces Sandra White and Mark MacDonald. Agenda item 1 is declarations of interest. The first item of the agenda is a declaration of interest by Chick Brodie and Richard Lyle. In accordance with Section 3 of the Code of Conduct, can I invite Chick Brodie to declare any interest relevant to the remit of the committee?
I have no interests relevant to this committee.
Thank you. Can I similarly ask Richard Lyle if he's any interests or wishes to declare interests relevant to the remit of the committee?
Thank you, Convener. I have no known interests relevant to this committee.
Thank you both. Can I move then to agenda item 2, which is choice of deputy convener. The next item is the selection of the deputy convener. Members are referred to paper 1 and the note by the clerk setting out the procedure for selecting a deputy convener. The Parliament has agreed that members of the Scottish National Party are eligible to be chosen as deputy convener for the Public Petitions Committee. This being the case, can I invite nominations for the position of deputy convener? Thank you. Are there any other nominations? One nomination has been received, and I therefore ask the committee to agree that Chick Brodie, MSP, be chosen as Deputy Convener of the Public Petitions Committee. Are we all agreed? Yes. Right, and can I welcome Chick Brodie as Deputy Convener? Item 3 is consideration of new petitions. There are 2 new petitions for consideration today. The first is PE 1441 by Professor David Crichton on flood insurance problems. Members have a note by the clerk. It's paper 2, the SPICE briefing. The petition and a supplementary evidence paper from Professor Crichton. Can I welcome both witnesses today, Professor Crichton and Ian Webb? You're very welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along. Can I invite Professor Crichton to make a short presentation of around 5 minutes. Then I'll ask a couple of questions and I'll throw it open to my colleagues to ask further questions after that. Professor Crichton.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today. I've asked Adrian Webb to join me. He represents a major insurer of homes in Scotland and one of the growing number of insurance companies which recognise the excellent work which has been done in Scotland to manage flood risks. My name is David Crichton. I have over 40 years' experience in the insurance industry and have written about 100 published textbooks and peer-reviewed papers, many on flood insurance. I brought one of the most recent ones with me, which I'll donate to the Parliament Library. This actually contains a lot of trade secrets about flood insurance, which you will not see anywhere else, and you may find it of interest. I've advised staff in almost every Scottish local authority on flood insurance matters. I'm speaking today in my personal capacity. I want to talk about a Scottish success story. Scotland has worked really hard since devolution to reduce its flood risks and now has a lower flood risk than England in at least 42 different ways. In 2010, the Dutch government, who know a bit about flooding, held up Scotland as an example to the rest of Europe for its work on sustainable flood management. Another publication I brought with me talks about sustainable flood management, and again I'll donate a copy to the library. I have a few spare copies if any members would like to take one away with them. Because Scotland's flood risk is so much lower, the net total flood insurance subsidy from Scotland to England and Wales is now running at over £13 million per year. The average flood insurance subsidy paid out is £3,660 per house per year for highest risk cases, almost all of which are in England or Wales. I'd like Parliament to consider all the issues, including many major issues like consumer choice, cross-selling, cherry-picking, and other issues that the big insurers would rather not talk about. I also propose a 3-point plan which could make flood insurance more affordable in Scotland. No primary legislation or taxpayers' money would be needed, just 3 ministerial signatures. It would be sensible, cheap, simple, quick and popular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Crichton, and I would encourage Adrian Webb to please get involved at any time you wish to contribute. Perhaps I can ask you just a couple of points. You may have seen the Sunday Times Money page on Sunday, which had quite an interesting article about flood insurance. Obviously, most of it was from the English perspective. But I understand that one of the points is that the current national agreement is coming to an end, I think, at the end of 2013. And I also understand that the Scottish Statement of Principles and Provision of Flood Insurance is also due to lapse. So I think there is some concerns around about that. The issue about Scottish consumers effectively subsidising England and Wales is an interesting one. I haven't heard before on that. Perhaps I could just ask you one point. If we take one example of an area which has had tremendous flood damage, you may know the White Sands area of Dumfries, which I happen to live for a number of years. Regularly there, all the shops get flooded. It's a chronic flood problem. Most of the shops cannot get flood insurance because of this, are facing huge risks as businesses. So in what sense are they subsidising English and Wales consumers? I was just a bit confused about that particular analogy. But perhaps you could talk about the Scottish statement and the issue of subsidy.
Yes, certainly. One has to be, I don't want to be singling out any particular newspaper, but my experience of the Sunday Times is they generally get their facts wrong. You may be misquoting them. The Statement of Principles does not run out at the end of 2013. It runs out at the end of June 2013, which is less than a year away. And after that time, there is no guarantee that flood insurance will be available. And that is really the gist of my petition, that we should be preparing for it and for whatever replaces the Statement of Principles. On the question of Dumfries, I know the White Sands area well. I have advised Dumfries local authority on flooding issues for considerable time. I have particular fond regard for Dumfries because it's one place where I don't have to spell my name. They are very familiar with the name Crichton.
I think it's a very well-known hospital that's named after you.
Yes. And I've toured White Sands, and that's a very interesting area. White Sands could easily eliminate its flood problems by dredging the river, but that would then disturb freshwater mussels, which are protected under EU directives. So the decision's been made, well, let's not dredge the river, let's protect the mussels because they're very important, and some people would say more important than people. As a result, the buildings in White Sands are very interesting. They have adapted to being flooded regularly. The Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's on 2 stories. The ground floor is not used. It is left to the flood. All their business is transacted on the first floor. There is disabled access to the first floor. The Tourist Information Office, similarly, the ground floor is not used. All of the activities are on the first floor. Most of the other buildings there are blighted, it's true, and probably unable to obtain flood insurance. But they still survive because they've adapted to make their buildings more resilient and more resistant. That is a solution, and that is why things like building standards are so important. Scotland probably leads Europe in its resilient building standards. And if you look at my second action point, I'm suggesting that insurers could make these building standards apply when they repair a building after a flood, so that we would then adapt our existing building stock to bring them all up to current building standard. And that would stand us in good stead for future flood events.
I think that's a very interesting analogy. I suppose you're saying then Dumfries has adopted this sort of Venice model for adapting to rising seawater.
Yeah, it's taken a conscious decision that we'll leave the mussels alone, we'll let people adapt their buildings so they get used to flood. I mean, since the war, I believe White Sands has flooded some 65 times, so people are quite used to it.
Could I ask you just two quick questions before I bring my colleagues in? To give you another experience, I had an experience of very large-scale flooding in Inverness on a fairly new estate, and was involved with the Council and Forestry Commission to try and sort that. But what kind of concerned me was, clearly planning permission was given for the estate, and obviously SEPA give you the once in 100 and once in 50 flood risks for each area. Do you feel enough is done at the planning permission stage to take on board possible flood risks?
I'm worried that perhaps it's not. During the time when councils had active flood liaison advice groups, which were compulsory under planning guidelines SPP 7, this was not a problem because I was a founder member of every flag, as they're called, and when I went to a council meeting, I was able to make sure that they did not grant planning permission in flood risk areas. And I did this on two issues. One, I could say, you appreciate that under Scots law, the planner can be legally liable for allowing planning permission in a flood risk area. And secondly, if the insurance industry pulls out, these properties will be blighted and will lose value. And I found that the mention of the word blight to a planner concentrated the mind wonderfully, and they stopped allowing building in the floodplain. Now, since SPP 7 has been replaced and flags are no longer compulsory, they are no longer being held by most local authorities. So planners are now once again free to do what they want, and I can't be held responsible for what they're doing.
And my final question before I bring my colleagues in, at a previous evidence session to another committee about flooding, the Met Office gave a very interesting presentation, and it was about flood prediction. And they were effectively saying there's a sort of radar system throughout Scotland which covers this. But the two huge gap areas are Murray, which you'll know have a horrendous flood record in the past, and I think Orkney and on Shetland are also have a problem. And there's a bit of a debate with Westminster and the Scottish Parliament about provision of filling these gaps. A couple of new, there is the possibility technically to cover these gaps, but there's a big cost involved. What's your own view about this technical aspect? Would more flood prediction through the Met Office radar stations help here?
The trouble is, if you predict a flood, there's not a lot you can do in a short notice. We really need more what I call cathedral thinking in the very long term, saying let's restore the floodplain, let's remove properties from the floodplain. I don't know if Adrian would like to comment on this.
Absolutely. The issue, I think, for most people setting policy is quite often they are driven by the most recent flood or short-term views. Flooding requires a long-term view. And one of the reasons I'm here today is partly because my company insures a lot of people in Scotland. We also employ a lot of people in Scotland. And we feel that, that Scotland has to have its say as part of a crucial debate regarding the Statement of Principles, which, as David said, comes to an end in June next year, and particularly because there is a divide between England and Wales as to the way that flood is approached, flood is managed. But the long-term view is something which we abandon at our peril when it comes to flooding. And we certainly support everything that's been said about resilience. Just reinstating a property to exactly as it was before. At the moment, that is what insurers do, because if anyone went and put the gilt edge onto the reinstatement of property, it would become uncompetitive in its market. What it really needs is for all insurers to be required to put that sort of resilience back into the system. And of course, it will benefit insurers long term. The problem is, as I say, in the short term, if your prices rise and your competitors don't, that's not a great thing for any business.
Right. Now, could I bring in my colleagues? I can start with Jackson Carlow.
Thank you. The reason I think you brought this petition to us is because you are concerned that when the Statement of Principles expires next year, the ongoing situation could be prejudicial for people in Scotland. Can I just understand first, the Statement of Principles, you say that since 1961 there has been a process, but the current Statement of Principles, which is due to expire, was agreed to when?
2008, I think.
2008. It actually, I think it goes back further to sort of 2002 it started.
Yeah, there was one then, and in 2008 they changed it to allow insurers to charge higher premiums.
Okay. And what I'd like to understand is, in the period since when it was established, we're at 2002 for example, and now, has the perceived subsidy that you think is being transferred from Scotland to England grown? In other words, has the position in Scotland improved and the position in England deteriorated during the course of the current Statement of Principles, or was the prejudicial balance in relation to Scotland inherent at the point at which the current statement was established?
The subsidy has certainly grown because flood claims are now much higher. The average flood claims over the last 10 years has been 450 million per year, but the previous 10 years it was only 150 million per year. But the main difference, of course, is that since devolution, the flood risk in Scotland has reduced enormously. If you look at the supplementary evidence that I've submitted, I show tables of the amount of properties in flood risk areas in Scotland compared with England. In England it's 23%, in Scotland it's 4.5%. Right. So the differential has grown enormously.
That's what I think I was trying to establish. And that is actually therefore why you don't think a new Statement of Principles would necessarily be in Scotland's interest going forward, because it would encompass that within the UK overall. So then it comes to the fact that you have clearly raised this concern with Scottish ministers, but the reason for you being here today would appear to be that, I don't know, you are uncertain of what response you have received to that. Are you able to expand on what you think is going on? Because it would seem to me to be fairly obvious from the way you've laid matters out that the Scottish Government would want to get involved in this matter and would see a very clear Scottish interest that required to be represented. So if I could ask you to think sort of laterally, why do you think you are not receiving the response that you would anticipate, and what do you think is going on that we need to find out?
Yeah, two issues there. One is the response. I have written to Richard Lochhead and Michael Russell, who I've known for many years and have advised on flood insurance issues in the past. And they have quite rightly forwarded the concerns to the Minister responsible, Mr. Stevenson. Now, I know that Mr. Stevenson has gone to London to talk to the Treasury on a couple of occasions, but he has never actually replied to me, and as far as I know, he has not lobbied the Treasury for the interests of Scotland. I say this because I myself have been directly involved in discussions with the Treasury and DEFRA, and there has been no mention of any special consideration being given to Scotland. So I don't know what Mr. Stevenson has told the Treasury. I strongly suspect he has not raised the issues that I'm raising here.
Okay, and finally, convener, because obviously Stuart Stevenson's now demitted office and has been replaced. Yeah. If the statement of principles expires in June 2013, what do you realistically think the time framework is for Scottish ministers to influence an outcome which might allow the solution that you perceive appropriate for Scotland to be achieved?
I think Adrian would like to comment on that.
Yeah, you mentioned 1961 earlier. 1961 is a very important year because that's the year in which it became compulsory, but on a sort of gentleman's agreement way, that the home insurance industry throughout the UK would include flood cover automatically as a part of every home insurance policy. That home insurance policies cannot be written in the UK unless under, I think, some very special circumstances, without flood cover being a part of that policy. There is a fear, of course, that if the market were to open up and flood policies started to be offered, home insurance policies started to be offered without that flood cover in place, that people would be guided by their pockets rather than the true risk. The worst cases we see as insurers are people who believe they'll never be flooded and then suddenly hit by a catastrophic flash flood. Because those are people who essentially the government becomes the insurer of the last resort. So since 1961, that has been in place. The statement of principles effectively requires insurers to continue offering insurance to people who have been flooded. Now, the expiry in June 2013, I think I would speak for every insurer and for the ABI, nobody wants that to fail. Nobody wants that to come to an end because the consequences don't bear thinking about. And I think now solutions are being sought for ways to get through that tying of current flood risks to certain insurers. And many things are being looked at in Whitehall. Many things are being considered. The reason I'm here and the reason David's here is because Scotland does have a particularly interesting position with regard to this because of the differences in the way that floods are managed, prevented and assessed. There may be problem areas in Scotland, and those will probably continue for some time. But overall, the view is more enlightened in Scotland, and that does lead to less flooding claims all in. And we think that is something which can't just be brushed over during all these considerations. However, I think it's unlikely that statement of principles will fail. I think there will be some form of bridge to be found. So I think there is still time for Scotland to have a say, and for the work that David has referred to, that has gone on since devolution to manage those risks, to be considered. And just a risk-based solution to, at the end of the statement of principles, might be the way to do it. But of course, there's also affordability issues and everything else. There is a problem with flooding in the UK. That is a problem.
Bring in Chick Brody. Could I perhaps just put some information into the public domain from SPICE, our information centre? They tell us that Scottish Government officials have been engaged in monthly discussions with DEFRA about the forthcoming lapse of the Scottish Statement of Principles that we mentioned. In addition, the formal Minister, Stuart Stevenson, met ABI and BIBA to discuss the way forward, and also wrote to the then Secretary of State, Caroline Spielman, after a statement on flood insurance. So I think there is some action there. It's useful, I think, to put on the record. Chick Brody.
Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. There is no such thing as a coincidence. In a previous life, I was a councillor in Surrey Heath. And one of the things that got up my Scottish ire was the level of grant made by council tax grant, I can't remember the levy now, to the council to cover flood protection, potential protection issues. In the basis, or on the basis of the review that you've made, have you taken into consideration not just the insurance impact, but the level of subsidy that is granted by the UK government to councils in the Thames Valley?
The question of flood defence subsidies is quite complicated. It's governed very much by Treasury rules, and the position is that the whole of the UK is a comparable level of subsidy when it comes to per head of population. But when you compare numbers at risk of flood, the subsidy per head of that is obviously very much lower in England and Wales because there are so many more people at risk of flood. In Scotland, because there's so many fewer at risk of flood, the subsidy works out much higher per head. But overall, per capita of population, the Scottish subsidy is actually less than in England and Wales. I would say that Surrey and the whole of the South East do manage to control floodplain development, despite the fact that there's a shortage of land and there's big pressures on new development. The number of properties built in floodplain in the South East is only around 5 or 6%, which is quite good going, really. Of course, it should be zero.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question. The Dundee University exercise, the flood insurance provision affordability, I mean, which was published in July, what conversations, if any, have you had with government or government officials on that particular report?
I have not talked to government about that. I have talked to Dundee University about it, but I've not felt it appropriate to discuss that report with government, nor have government asked me for comments on it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just a couple of issues, particularly in relation to the paperwork you've submitted, Professor Crichton, and quite useful paperwork, I feel, in particular the Crichton three-point plan that you've listed on the back page. And you've indicated there that Scotland could easily apply current building standards retrospectively to the repairs of any properties damaged by flood or storm. The issue about retrospective planning application in terms of buildings in relation to any damage caused, surely that would cause premiums to rise for those individual property owners. And some examples that we've heard from in the last couple of weeks down south is that insurance premiums have risen by an order of 4 times what they used to be prior to the damage taking place. If the Scottish Government were to apply this retrospective ruling to say that you must, when you're carrying out any repairs, bring it up to current building standards for flood prevention, who would be the ultimate payer of the cost for that? Would it be the individual being insured, or would you expect the Scottish Government to step in and cover the costs?
That's an excellent question. First of all, I wouldn't expect the Scottish Government to step in to cover that cost. But what I would expect the Scottish Government to do would be to participate in negotiations with the insurance industry to say, look, on the one hand, most insurers, Mr. Webb's company being an exception, do not take into account the 42 ways in which Scotland manages its flood risk better than England. You are saving a lot of money by writing business in Scotland. Let's use some of that saving to pay for resilient reinstatement. And I am sure insurers are reasonable people, and when the facts are pointed out to them, it would be possible to make some sort of deal where they would say, okay, we recognise Scotland's doing things better. Let's throw in the resilient reinstatement at no extra charge, because we know that we're going to end up benefiting in the long run.
Mr. Webb, any comments?
Well, the only thing I would say is the point I made earlier on is that I don't think resilience would cost hugely more than current reinstatement, particularly if that was the way that things are done, because the suppliers who are capable of doing that would come forward and would benefit as a result. Prices would go down and economics would come into play. The important thing is that it happens across the board. If that was the standard, we have to comply with it. On the 21st of December this year, every insurer in the land has to have gender-neutral pricing. We don't all agree with that rule, but we have to do it. That's just how it is, and eventually a new level will be found. But talking about resilience, some of the things we were talking about is simply sort of the electric wires coming down from the ceiling rather than coming up from the floor. These things are not massively more costly than the current ways of doing things. It's just that they're not the current ways of doing things. And I think an approach would probably be welcomed by all insurers, because ultimately, if we take the long-term view, resilient houses are going to cost less to repair and reinstate next time by a huge factor. And flood risk is not going to go away in this country.
There's also the climate change adaptation aspect. When you have flood, you end up throwing a lot of stuff into landfill, and you've got to generate new bricks and cement and plasterboard, which have very high embodied energy, which again is bad for climate change.
Professor Crichton, you made reference earlier to the planners in Scotland, and the planners being more diligent in relation to the release of land for building. You never made any reference to developers who, in some occasions, put pressure on local authorities and planners to release land for building. And yet some local experiences show that there could be potential risk of flood, minor risk of flood, but there could still be some potential risk. How do we ensure or get the message over to developers as well as planners that we have to be watchful of what sites are being released and the historic examples of where floods have taken place in those areas? And finally, and this question, the displacement that takes place. Because there is some displacement does take place in certain developments when developers are infilling sites to make the site more suitable for construction.
Right. Another excellent question. Thank you. The first thing is, when I first started running flags, flood liaison and advice groups, I brought planners, developers and SEPA all together around a table. Planners told me afterwards that they were so relieved that at last they had somebody on their side in the fight against developers. Developers were wanting to build in the floodplain, elected officers were wanting to build in the floodplain, and the planner was on his own, isolated, trying to stop it. And he found that having the insurance industry backing him against the developer made all the difference in the world. And eventually, from talking to developers informally around a table, they began to see it our way as well. And they gradually disposed of their land banks in flood risk areas. And that's the civilised way to do it. But if they don't do it, in Scotland we have the great advantage of the 1985 legislation, which allows insurers to sue the developer for recovery of the flood claims costs. Now, that legislation does not apply in England and Wales. In England and Wales, the developer is above the law. He is legally immune from being sued. So that is one of the big differences between Scotland and England. The problem, perhaps, is that many insurers are not even aware of this 1985 legislation, and they do not proceed against the developer. If they were, that would make more developers think twice about trying to build in the floodplain. And the final point about infilling, I'm very conscious that, especially in Glasgow, there is the issue of urban regeneration, of building in the floodplain to fill in gaps where old buildings have had to be demolished and rebuilt. I think insurers are prepared to live with that, if you're talking about an area that already has good flood defences, and you're talking about buildings that are designed for the floodplain. For example, the ground floor used only for car parking. That is obviously already the situation in places like Dundee, for example, and the Thames Gateway. There's no reason why you can't have new buildings in the floodplain as long as they are designed to be flooded. And people who buy them know that they're designed to be flooded. Do you want to add anything?
I think it's absolutely hit the nail on the head. One of the things I was going to say about the flood liaison advisory groups, the crucial thing about them, and the reason we're sort of very sad that they're not absolutely required anymore, is that they brought local knowledge to bear on the issue. Now, developers, however we view them, are in business. They're in business to develop properties, houses, and everything. The beauty of the flags was that they brought together local knowledge and expertise and also local interest to bear upon those issues. And I think the planners, as David said, are sometimes the last line of defence against occasionally elected officials and developers who would be very keen to do something, very keen to put the views as to why it should happen, and often there are very good social reasons why it should happen. But if flood-resilient properties can be built, then this is potentially viable. The problem is if ordinary properties are built on floodplains with fingers crossed.
One of the big issues in England, I should add, is that the developers have learned that if they build for owner-occupiers, they can't sell the houses because people can't afford the insurance. So what they do is build for social housing, schools and hospitals. So England, you're finding thousands of schools built in the floodplain, hundreds of hospitals built in the floodplain, and the rest is filled in with social housing. So the most vulnerable people in our society end up living in the most hazardous areas.
Thank you, Professor Crichton, and I also thank you for reminding us of the 1985 legislation that hopefully developers and others will take note of and be reminded that the legislation is in place. The next issue, and you made reference to SEPA, and I know that SEPA are supposed to be the body that oversees potential developments for flood risk. Has SEPA, in your view, carried out its duties effectively and efficiently, particularly when it comes into the question of new developments taking place on potential floodplains? Because I've often heard people comment that when SEPA are asked by a planning department for a view, they normally sign off saying no issues identified. Is it possible for you to give an indication of where you think SEPA sits in this process?
There's another fantastic question that really goes to the heart of things. SEPA can't be faulted. They are excellent in every way. They are leading experts on hydrology and flood risk. I wouldn't knock them at all. They are very good. What I would say is they are sometimes, shall we say, constrained by their masters into how dogmatic they can be about advice. And this is quite understandable when they're giving official, formal advice. They have to be very careful what they say and how they express it. One of the beauties about flags was that SEPA were there informally and could talk informally about their concerns in front of me as an insurer, the planner, and the property developer. And they could say, look, okay, we might not be able to object to this, but really it's not wise to build here. So again, it's a loss from flags disappearing that we are losing out on this informal advice, which was so valuable.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener.
Thank John Wilson for his points. Could I just take you back to the interesting point about the 1985 Act, and perhaps ask Adrian Webb, in your experience with your own company, I mean, has your own company in Scotland ever sued a developer to reclaim insurance costs?
Not to my knowledge.
Right.
Not to my knowledge.
I know you can't possibly comment on competitors, but are you aware of any actions by any other companies under that Act? Perhaps Mr. Professor Crichton?
The main one I'm aware of was actually pursued by a property developer, Barrett's Construction, would you believe? And they pursued the planning officer for allowing them to build in an area that was subsequently flooded. So that's poacher-turned gamekeeper, if you like.
Assuming it's not sub judice, was the action successful?
It didn't go to that extent. There was settlement out of court.
Right.
But what amazes me is that insurers haven't used it. On the other hand, just the threat that it could be used has prevented many developments taking place.
It may well be a point that the committee wishes to pursue with insurance companies in Scotland. It's, I think, a very interesting point I wasn't aware of.
It is one of the key elements that David was talking about earlier on, of the differences between what happens as soon as you go across Hadrian's Wall, and the reason why I think it's very important that Scotland has a clear voice at such a crucial time, when, you know, we are facing a very interesting 9 months up to the end of June 2013, and I know that all parties, the Association of British Insurers, everybody is ultimately after a constructive solution. But I think you know, the problem with us down in the southeast is people tend to be a little bit you know, Whitehall centric in their considerations, if I may say so.
Well, there's anything north of Islington. There is some other legislation that's relevant. It's the 1999 Highways Act and the 2009 Flood Act, particularly the 2009 Flood Act, which makes local authorities have a statutory duty to prevent flooding. There's nothing like that in England and Wales.
Yeah, because one of the, again, the personal experience I had with the very bad flooding in Inverness was a lack of maintenance for culverts, for example, which caused huge problems, particularly in hillside development. Yeah. If I could bring in Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Hope you can bear with me. I've got a bit of a cold today. I was interested in Professor Crichton's comments regarding cherry picking by insurance companies. I'm sure we've all got local examples. Clearly, I've got a great deal of sympathy with Professor Crichton's petition, given that there's an area in my constituency where residents have found it extremely difficult to source insurance due to the threat of flooding. And also in my constituency, we have an issue where we require flood defences to protect major national industries in Grangemouth at an estimated cost of up to £100 million, which SEPA are currently working on at the moment. But from the evidence that we're hearing today, it's clear that you would like to see a return of the flood liaison advice groups, and if there was any way of incorporating that into new legislation, perhaps through the better regulation bill that's currently going through Parliament, presumably you'd be keen to see that.
Yeah, it's an excellent issue, and I'm glad you raised the issue of Grangemouth. In fact, Falkirk Council is one of the last local authorities to still have flag meetings, and they are very useful because they are particularly concerned about Grangemouth. The Bowness flood defence scheme is well advanced, as you'll know, but Grangemouth is a problem with 6,000 houses at risk, and also, of course, the oil refinery. And the big issue about Grangemouth, of course, is that the local authority are expected to manage that flood risk. But as I've pointed out to the Rural Affairs and Environment Committee of this House, this is not a local issue. If Grangemouth is flooded, it has implications for the whole of Scotland and the north of England. And really that is a strategic issue that should be considered on a national basis. The answer to Grangemouth is not easy. Building a flood defence there is a problem because of all the tributaries and pipelines that would make it extremely expensive. As you may know, I have suggested a radical alternative, which is a flood barrage across the River Forth. I suggested that at the time a replacement crossing was being considered. It would actually be cheaper than the replacement crossing that's going ahead, and it could have doubled up as a flood defence to protect Grangemouth and Longannet. Now, if there was a storm surge in the River Forth, both Grangemouth and Longannet could be wiped out. So you would be without oil and electricity for the whole of Scotland for many months. Not only that, but the Asda distribution centre would be knocked out as well. So you'd be without or short of food and groceries for maybe a year, which seems to me to be a strategic threat that should perhaps be given a little bit more consideration.
Yes, thank you. The government have set up the Regulatory Review Group, which is looking at a number of these issues at the moment. So the government is certainly well aware of the situation, but clearly, you know, a 1 in 200 year storm could come along next year, which is obviously of concern. But clearly, if we can get the flags up and running in other local authorities, it clearly would be of benefit to these areas in Scotland. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does any other member wish to raise any points? Yes, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. I note within your paper, Professor Crichton, you've raised concerns with the National Flood Forum of England and Wales and also the Scottish Flood Forum. Can you tell us what they've come back to say to you, or what other discussions you're having with them?
Okay, the National Flood Forum, I say in quotes National Flood Forum because they only deal with England and Wales, so they're not UK national, and they are only concerned about England and Wales. I deal with them because I deal with the UK as a whole. Obviously they're not particularly interested in what happens in Scotland. The Scottish Flood Forum is a very good organisation. But their remit does not extend to things like the Statement of Principles and flood insurance. They are concerned about support for flood survivors, and in that they do a first-class job. So we're really talking about apples and oranges. Neither of them include flood insurance problems in Scotland as a part of their remit.
You've just said that the National Flood Forum of England doesn't care about Scotland, and I found your next comment quite interesting. DEFRA and HMT, basically are discussions you're suggesting are very much against the interests of Scotland.
I wouldn't say they're against interests deliberately. They just assume Scotland is a northern province of England. You may have found that in other cases as well.
Okay, thanks very much for those comments.
Okay, does any other member wish to contribute? Okay. Well, can I first of all thank both our witnesses? I think that this has been an excellent discussion. I think all members of the committee have been impressed with our witnesses today. My own view is that I think it's really important that we continue this petition. I think there's a lot of meat in the suggestions. And I, for one, would certainly be wanting to write to the Scottish Government. I think the new Minister is Paul Wheelhouse, and it may well be that the committee wish to ask Mr Wheelhouse to speak to the committee about these issues in the future. But in the very least, I think we should ask him about what steps they have taken to ensure that Scottish interests are represented in discussions with DEFRA and the UK insurance industry, how they plan to respond to the work undertaken by the Centre of Expertise for Waters at Dundee University, and also write to them as well about the views of the petition. But could I also suggest that we write to the insurance industry in its global sense in Scotland, and perhaps John Wilson might have some more technical aspects to this, particularly to ask how they respond to the 1985 Act. I would like to know what actions have been taken, whether it's gone to court or not, against developers and planners where the insurance industry has had to pay money out where there's been building on floodplains. I think that was a very good point that Professor Crichton made. John Wilson?
Thank you, Convener. And Professor Crichton's made a number of good points in this debate, and I think, as well as the organisations you've highlighted in the Scottish Government, could I suggest we write to the UK Government as well to ask them their views on this, as well as SEPA, COSLA, you've already mentioned ABI Scotland. I could also suggest we write to Scottish House Builders Association to ask them the views on this as well, because I think, given the reference to the 1985 legislation, it might be worthwhile reminding Scottish House Builders Association that this exactly there, and maybe write to Homes for Scotland as well.
Okay, can I check?
Rudy?
Thank you, Convener. Just in addition to that, I think in the conversation or in the letter and the communication to DEFRA and HMT, it's regrettable, if not dangerous, that the Scottish Government is not represented in any way, and I think we should make that point, that there should be a representation, notwithstanding Professor Crichton's attendance.
Yeah, I think the Spice Brief points out that there's monthly meetings between Scottish Government officials and DEFRA, but nevertheless, I think if we have the Minister here, that's a point I think we can certainly make. In terms of the Minister, would members of the committee want to wait until we've had a response from the Scottish Government before we invite the Minister? Right, we'll look at that at a future meeting. Are members happy with that range of options that we're considering? Or is there any additional points we've maybe missed that members would... Angus MacDonald?
I was just wondering, it may not be normal practice, but would it be in order just now to send a courtesy letter to the Committee of Rural Affairs and Climate Change, just advising them of the petition, not referring it to them, but just advising them of the situation?
I think informally the clerks do talk to each other, but currently it's before us, and if we decide to refer it, then that's something we can do at a later stage.
Okay.
But it's certainly currently, it's perfectly within our powers to, to pursue this particular point. Okay. Do any other members wish to contribute? Are members happy then with that course of action identified? Well, finally, can I thank again both our witnesses for the excellent contribution. Clearly, we're very interested as a committee, and we'll keep you informed with developments. And I'll suspend for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attention. And if you need me again, I'm very happy to come.
Definitely. Thank you. If I can restart the committee. The second new petition is PE 1445 by Ashton Radcliffe on behalf of the Swan Action Group, brackets Angus Glens, on stopping the wind farm at Nathrow. The committee is invited to make a decision on admissibility of this petition, and could I draw members' attention to paper 3 by the clerk in the petition, and if I could highlight a couple of points. The petition is calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to refuse a specific wind farm planning application that has been submitted to the Scottish Government for determination. The petition effectively seeks parliamentary intervention or interference with the decision-making process of the Scottish Government as it applies to a particular application. The Parliament clearly has no power to do this, and my recommendation to the committee is that we rule that this petition is not admissible. Before I move on, could I ask members for their views on that particular view? John Wilson.
You're correct to say this is effectively a live planning application. that, as we believe, is to be considered by the Scottish Government ministers. As such, I don't think it's appropriate that the committee should deal with this petition at the present time. However, I would suggest that when we contact the petitioners, we remind them that pending the decision, the outcome decision by Scottish Government ministers on the life planning application, they are free to bring forward a petition of a more general nature regarding the planning process or wind farm development processes. But at the present moment, I feel the committee's hands are tied because it is a live planning process that's ongoing at the present time. And until such times, the committee doesn't have the authority to intervene or participate in that issue.
Can I ask the views of other members? Are members agreeable with that approach? I think we've now ruled that for the individual application it's admissible, and John Wilson's an interesting point about if it's a wider, Scottish-wide issue, it can certainly come back to us. But I think that local members, Nigel Don, wishes to make a point.
Well, thank you, Convener. Can I say I'm not surprised at the committee's ruling, and I think it would be very helpful, actually, if my constituent who brought this were to consider bringing something forward which would be more general and more strategic and would make some of the important points which I think this particular application does exemplify. But it's entirely clear that this particular petition is I think, as the committee has ruled, probably misconceived.
Yeah, and thanks for coming along, Mr. Don. So is that decision agreed? Great, thank you for that. Can I move then to agenda item 4, consideration of current petitions. There are 5 current petitions for consideration today. The first current petition is PE 1285 by Caroline Mockford on free calls to NHS 24 for mobile phones. Members have a note by the clerk, it's paper 4. Can invite contributions from members. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. A note from the report before us. We are still awaiting the Sheffield University evaluation report, and that was expected to be available by the Department of Health by the end of June 2012. Could I suggest we write to the Scottish Government and ask, has or when will the evaluation report be submitted for consideration by the Government, and when will the Scottish Government consider the report? Because I feel that I would like to keep the petition open until such times as we've heard the Scottish Government's views on the Sheffield report, so we can actually take forward the issue if we need to take forward the issue, or make a decision at the time the full facts are available to us and the actions proposed by the Scottish Government based on the report.
I understand, just for information, that the Department of Health in England have received the report and they'll make decisions on its actual publication, so it sounds like it's imminent. Any other member wish to contribute? Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Convener. Really just to carry on from what John Wilson has just said, I think it's really important that we do consider the seriousness of the petition once we've got all the facts together, and I think it's important that we do hold off till we get that report to make our judgment then.
Yes, Chip Rory.
Just on a general point, I mean, I agree with the points that have been made, but as this is my first meeting, I get kind of concerned when I go through reports saying there's been no response, or there's been delayed response, or the petitioner has no indication. I think at some stage we need to consider exactly how we accelerate the whole response procedure. We had this problem in another committee about inaccuracies and what have you. I mean, as a general point, I think we need to make sure that everything is being done by this committee and others to make sure that we are responding to people who bring these petitions, not in any degree of flippancy. I just get concerned that we're not being responsive.
Well, I think Chip Brody makes a good point. It's certainly one the committee is very familiar with, and I think it's fair to say the committee is not slow at coming forward when we've had deviant organisations, and use the term in inverted commas, of course, who have not returned information to us. Clearly, lots of organisations are busy but I think it is important that we are representing the Parliament. I think it affects the dignity of the Parliament if local authorities, health boards or other agencies don't respond. So I have absolutely no problem at all with publicly naming organisations that consistently fail to respond. And in fairness, it is sometimes the same one or two organisations that make it very difficult for us to do our job correctly.
Okay.
Are members agreeable with the points, John Wilson's points about the next step? Thank you for that. Can we move to the second current petition for consideration today? It's PE 1395 by Jan Kulik on target funding for lesser taught languages and cultures at universities. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions and invite contributions from members. I think this has been an excellent petition for which we got very good oral evidence session, and a number of students, I think, from Glasgow University turned up to listen to the debate. But and ask members for their views on the next steps. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. I'm rather concerned, Convener, at the response we've received from the petitioner in relation to the Scottish Funding Council's reply to this committee. The petitioner seems to raise what I would consider to be serious concerns about the information that has been provided by the Scottish Funding Council. And could I recommend to the committee that we write to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council with the petitioner's response to the correspondence and ask them for their views as to the petitioner's comments, because the petitioner does say while certain courses continue at Glasgow University, the courses can only be taken up to year 2 and cannot be carried on to full degree course. This does raise concerns, and it is at odds from my reading of the Scottish Funding Council's letters and submissions to us. So I would seek the committee's approval that we write to both the Scottish Government and the Funding Council to ask them to comment and respond to the issues raised by the petitioner.
Members agreeable with that, or does any member have a contrary view? Right, thank you for that. Can we move on to the third current petition for consideration today? It's PE 1421 by Gail Robertson on behalf of the Outer Hebrides Transport Group on fair ferry fares. Members have a note by the clerk, paper 6 and submissions. This is clearly an issue I'm personally particularly very interested in, and my colleague, I think Rhoda Grant, raised this issue at the last meeting. I think it does make sense to continue the petition until the work of the impact study has been reported. Although I didn't feel personally that the information requested about the whole issue about concessionary fares was properly answered. And I know Angus MacDonald's got particular knowledge from the Stornoway area, might want to comment. But I think it does make sense to continue as to we get a little bit more information from the impact study, because clearly the changes are having a big impact on industry particularly. And I know that Gail Robertson's done an excellent job on behalf of the Outer Hebrides Transport Group, and they've not been slow at coming forward, as I'm sure members of all political persuasions will be aware. Angus MacDonald, do you wish to comment?
Well, no, just to concur, Convener, that it would be only fair to wait until we have the results of the impact study. So I would be happy to agree to keep the petition open for the time being.
Do any other members wish to contribute? Are members happy with that course of action? Yeah. Right, thank you for that. The fourth current petition for consideration today is PE 1424 by Joyce Harkness on behalf of the Road to Health CPPP 3 team on improving transport provision for older people in remote and rural areas, and members have a note by the clerk's paper 7 submission. Can invite contributions from members. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Clearly, what you never mentioned, Convener, was the issue regarding the additional paper that's been submitted to us this morning from the petitioner. But clearly the petitioner has some concerns about what the decisions that have been made so far and the lack of response in terms of the British Pakistani Youth Council. Sorry.
Yes, we're
sorry,
on
Convener.
the Road to Health.
But my apologies,
yeah.
Convener, skipping ahead.
Jackson Carlo.
I think, Convener, it would appear that we are still waiting on the working group to timetable for publishing a report. I think we do need to see that. I mean, it's clear from the earlier members' business debate, which preceded the last meeting the committee held to consider all of this, felt that was appropriate. It does seem quite a long time now for us to be, again, waiting in the publication of the report. So I think if we can write asking what the timetable for that is and doing all we can to expedite its publication to allow us to proceed.
I think that's sensible. Right. I know members may pick up a theme in some of these petitions that we're waiting for information to come back. I do think, however, it's important that we're properly cited, and we need that correct information to appear before we can make final decisions. So that said, I think it is a useful next step. So are members agreeable then that we wait for the working group? Yeah. Right. Thank you.
But, can I ask,
Check, Brodie?
just on the earlier point, these reports, as Jackson Carlos just raised, in terms of, it's all very well saying we're going to produce a report. It would be helpful if at the end they said when they're going to produce it.
Yeah, that's, I think, a good point. Can we go to the fifth and final current petition? It's PE 1435 by Wajahat Nasser on the Scottish Pakistan Youth Council. Members, a note by the clerk, paper 8, and John Wilson, I think, rightly said that there's additional paper on this as well that members just want to have a quick look at before making a decision, and can invite contributions from members. I'll bring John Wilson in again.
Thank you, Convener. My apologies for skipping some pages in terms of committee paperwork this morning. Convener, clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the petitioners raised issues of concern about responses or the response we've received so far. Clearly, there has been developments within the Scottish Government because, as well as Fiona Hislop as the European and International Affairs Cabinet Secretary, we now have a new Minister for International Development. So it might be worthwhile, Convener, if the committee write to the Scottish Government again with the petitioners' concerns and ask whether or not the Scottish Government would reconsider the petitioner's request, given that the Scottish Government clearly seem to think there is a bigger role for international development now with the appointment of an additional minister to cover that portfolio.
Okay. Any other members wish to contribute? Richard Lyle.
Convener, I'm interested in the paragraph where it said they would write to a more appropriate working body, which has similar interests. Do we know which body that would be? Do we know which body that would be?
I'm sorry,
sorry, in the paragraph, in the second paragraph of the petitioner's further letter, is basically suggesting that his petition has not received a reply from the Youth Council, and he's asking us to write to another appropriate working body which has similar interests.
Yeah.
Do we know who that is?
No, we don't.
Can we find out who, from the petitioner, you know, who he means, or who he's suggesting that we also write to, apart from the suggestion made by John Wilson?
Yeah, we can certainly ask the petitioner for clarification as well. That's a good point.
Okay.
Jackson Carlo?
I'm sort of slightly unclear, not having been here when this was last discussed, but are there any Scottish representatives within the British Pakistani Youth Council? I mean, it seems to me that there's a complete indifference to the proposal emanating from there, and yet if it is a British organisation, I would expect there to be Scottish representatives that young people of Pakistani origin might wish to represent their concerns to in the first instance in order that the matter be raised there. Yeah. I don't know it's entirely incumbent upon us to be doing that. I think that there's a bit of self-help required in trying to promote the matter as well.
And I think, if I understand correctly, the Scottish Government's point is that setting this up is really a matter for the petitioner rather than a matter for Scottish Government. So that's the view the Scottish Government's taken. And notwithstanding that, obviously there has been some changes and you might get a slightly different view, but I think the self-help issue is quite an important one as well, so we need to make sure the petitioner is aware of that. Are members happy with that approach? Could I then formally close the meeting, and if members could just stay behind just for a second, I've got some matters to raise in private.